Holland Hitch presents rebuilding procedures for the Holland 3500 fifth wheel top plate. The fifth wheel is a critical component of every tractor and trailer. To perform reliably and safely, it must be maintained and inspected at regular intervals. Before beginning any rebuilding procedures, carefully review all of the troubleshooting hints provided on page 3 of the rebuild manual. You may find that rebuilding the fifth wheel is not necessary. If these troubleshooting hints do not resolve your problems, the fifth wheel may need rebuilding. The steps we are about to show you are covered in the manual that comes with your rebuild kit. Read the manual first and refer to it while watching this video and during the rebuilding procedures. It includes illustrations and step-by-step instructions you will need to complete the rebuild of your fifth wheel. Rebuilding should only be performed by a qualified service technician following Holland procedures and using genuine Holland Rebuild Kit parts. Rebuild kits are available from Holland Hitch distributors worldwide. Since there are many different models of fifth wheels, check the manual that accompanies each kit to make sure you have the correct rebuild kit for the fifth wheel you are about to rebuild. The XA351 top plate is a different design than the XA3501 and must be rebuilt using the proper rebuild kit. An XA351 top plate can be identified by the closed loop style release handle and the nut and bolt bracket pin retention system. Begin rebuilding by totally disassembling the fifth wheel and discarding all used components. Thoroughly steam clean the top plate and inspect it for cracks and loose lock pin holes. Then closely inspect the front lock surface of the top plate. The front lock surface must be free of cracks, burrs, or other signs of damage. Do not attempt rebuilding of the fifth wheel if the top plate is cracked, the lock pins do not fit tightly into the top plate, or the front lock surface is damaged in any way. As you rebuild, use all the rollers, cotter pins, springs, bolts, nuts, and washers provided in the kit. A small tube of never-seez lubricant is provided with the kit. Make sure it is used on the required surfaces as described in the video. Do not reuse old parts. Begin by placing the fifth wheel upside down with the ramps facing away from you as shown. Lubricate the lock pin holes of the lock jaws with never-seez. Align the lock jaws in the casting so that the kingpin guides are facing up as shown. Align the holes in the lock pins for easy cotter pin insertion. Then, making sure the holes in the locks are in line with the holes in the casting, drive the lock pins into the casting and through the lock jaws until the heads of the lock pins are flush with the casting. Insert the 1/4 by 2 inch cotter pins and spread. Check for free movement of both lock jaws. Position a 2-inch diameter plug into the lock jaws as shown. A lock gauge, Holland part number TF0237, is available at all Holland distributors. Warning: you must use a Holland lock gauge, TF0237, or a precision plug that is 2 inches plus or minus 5 thousandths for proper assembly of the locking mechanism. Lubricate both sides of the yoke tips with a light grease. Then slide the yoke into the top plate with the threaded hole in the yoke facing up. Make sure the yoke is firmly seated. Check for proper engagement of the yoke and locks. The yoke tips must be at least flush with the ends of the lock jaws or extend no more than 1/2 inch beyond the lock jaws. If the tips of the yoke extend more than 1/2 inch past the end of the locks, do not use the yoke. Contact your nearest Holland distributor for replacement yoke part number XA07295THK. Now install the yoke spring. Position the yoke shaft so that the pre-drilled hole is facing up. Then slide the yoke shaft into the casting, through the spring, and into the yoke, aligning the recessed hole in the shaft with the threaded hole in the yoke. Now, in this order, slide the lock adjustment tag, rubber bushing, and metal washer onto the end of the yoke shaft. Lubricate the exposed threads of the yoke shaft with never seize. Then start the lock nut onto the shaft until finger tight. Install the lock spring as shown. The following steps cover release handle installation for right-hand release fifth wheels. Pass the S-bend end of the release handle through opening B in the side rib of the casting. In this order, slide the 1 3/8 inch washer, release handle spring, and 1 1/16 inch washer over the S-bend of the release handle. Use the 1 1/16 inch washer to compress the spring until the cotter pin hole in the handle is exposed. Then insert and spread the 1/8 inch cotter pin. The cotter pin must be completely spread around the release handle as shown. The following steps cover cam plate installation for right-hand side release fifth wheels. Inspect the cam plate for burrs or rough edges and remove. Lubricate the cam profile and pivot holes with a light grease. Position the cam plate so that the release handle tab is facing up as shown. Insert the S-bend of the release handle into the cam plate tab and position the cam plate hole over the casting lug hole opposite the release handle side. Slide a 1 3/4 inch washer between the cam plate and the casting lug hole with the rounded side of the washer facing the cam plate. Note, when installing washers, the rounded edge of the washers must always face the cam plate. Install the 1/2 inch roller into the cam plate and place a second 1 3/4 inch washer on top of the roller with the rounded side facing the cam plate. Install the 1/2 inch bolt through the washers, roller, and top plate lug. Secure the bolt with a 1/2 inch nut. Tighten securely. Then check for free movement of the cam plate. Next, align the cam plate track so that it is over the threaded hole in the yoke. Slide a 2 5/8 washer between the yoke and cam plate with the rounded side of the washer facing the cam plate. Center the washer over the threaded hole in the yoke. Install the 5/8" roller into the cam plate and place a second 2 5/8" washer on top of the roller with the rounded side facing the roller. Install the 5/8" bolt through the washers, roller, cam plate, and into the threaded hole in the yoke. Make sure the bolt enters the threaded hole in the yoke shaft. Tighten securely. Then check for free movement of the cam plate. Insert new grease fittings into the holes in the mounting bracket pockets as shown. The XA351 fifth wheel is available with an automatic or manual secondary lock. To install an automatic secondary lock, grease the hole in the lock arm with never seize. Next, start the 1/2" roll pin into the open casting lug hole. Position the spring onto the secondary lock and align with the roll pin in the casting. Now, drive the roll pin into the casting until it is flush with the top of the lug. Check for proper spring action. To install a manual secondary lock, grease the larger hole in the lock arm with never seize. Next, start the 1/2" roll pin into the open casting lug hole. Next, slide the secondary lock release handle through the small hole in the casting next to the primary release handle. Insert the S-bend of the release handle into the larger hole at the end of the secondary lock. Now, position the secondary lock spring onto the secondary lock end. Align with the roll pin in the casting. Drive the roll pin into the casting until flush with the top of the lug. Check that the release handle can be hooked on the casting in the open position and for proper spring action when manually engaged. Warning: before placing the fifth wheel back into service, it must be properly adjusted. Start by opening the locks and removing the 2" plug. Turn the wheel right side up and close the locks using a Holland lock tester. A Holland lock tester with a precision SAE kingpin must be used for proper lock adjustment. The locks are adjusted against both the 2" and 2 7/8" diameter of the kingpin, and a 2" pin or plug will not properly adjust the fifth wheel. Tighten the adjustment nut until it is snug against the rubber bushing. The nut should be snug, but you should still be able to turn it by hand. Now, alternate tightening the adjustment nut clockwise 1/4 turn at a time and rotating the lock tester back and forth. You will feel resistance between the locks and the lock tester kingpin. Continue to tighten the adjustment nut until the resistance against the lock tester is reduced. The locks are properly adjusted when you can easily rotate the lock tester by hand, but you can still feel some resistance against the lock tester. The fifth wheel locks are now properly adjusted. Finally, verify proper operation of the fifth wheel by opening and closing it with the lock tester at least 3 times. The locks must close completely around the kingpin on each attempt, and the adjustment nut and rubber bushing must be seated against the casting as shown. When rebuilding a fifth wheel, perform each step with attention to detail. The key steps we've covered in this video include inspection of the top plate, lock installation, yoke installation, release handle and cam plate installation, secondary lock installation, and lock adjustment and operation check. In general, remember to lubricate all moving parts during assembly. Be sure to follow each step of the procedure completely and observe safe practices and precautions at every stage. As a vital part of every tractor-trailer, the fifth wheel deserves quality maintenance performed by experienced personnel. Holland is proud to provide the people and products that go the distance.